So I'm going to say a little bit first about my own background, and then we're going to briefly look at bios of Campbell and Jung and their work. Very brief, which is tragic, but we only have 2 hours, so we could do whole courses of study. And then we're going to look at the story where the two came to their father, which is a Navajo ritual story that is part of the Navajo ceremonial complex. The best known ones are the blessing way and the enemy way. And the Navajo singer that gave this story specified that this was distinct from both of them. But it was designed for warriors who were going into battle. And the singer that gave this to the ethnologist Maud Oakes said that he was giving it to soldiers that were going to World War II. And he really believed it was in danger of dying out because the young men weren't learning it anymore. And that's why he gave it to her, and that's why we're able to enjoy it tonight. So much gratitude to him, which we'll talk more about him in a moment. And then we're going to look at some contemporary perspectives of people that I see as complementary to Jung and Campbell and their orientation, and how the ritual of the ritual of storytelling is being continued in theater today, and also through theater-type practices in a therapeutic environment. So we'll do that for about an hour, and then we'll have a discussion and Q&A until they shut the lights off on us, and as long as you all want to stay. So my background academically, I started out in anthropology for my undergraduate degree. I had always really loved Jung and wanted to continue to look at his work, but figured out very quickly that in psychology, at least in the academy, that he was pretty much absent, that he was no longer within that structure. And so I switched to anthropology as a way to look at various human cultures and see what myths they told themselves. I thought that was probably the best, as close as I could get within a traditional degree. Within that time frame, I looked at two things, specifically. One was, because I minored in Latin American studies, were the dirty wars in Latin America, Central and South America, in the 60s through the 80s, specifically in Chile, and also the cultural roots of the Vietnam War. And through looking at both of those things, when looking at Latin America, and specifically Chile, I did a research on Chilean women and their creation of what they called arpilleras, and they are quilts that are embroidered, where they told the stories of their husbands and brothers and sons who had been kidnapped and disappeared and tortured and killed. This was, to me, was a really beautiful example of Jung's theories and work, which we'll get into, but getting together in a group, sharing your story, creating a piece of art to transcend that suffering. And then, interestingly enough, the Catholic Church smuggled those quilts out of the country, and that is one of the primary ways that what was actually happening in Chile and in other countries became known to the wider world. So to me, I saw it as a really unique application. Not that they were saying they were using Jung's methods, but to me it was demonstrable that this was akin to what he was talking about. The other thing was as I said, the cultural roots of the Vietnam War. So my father was a Vietnam veteran, and so it was a subject that was important to me, seeing the fallout with him and his peers of just that lack of support and that division in the culture. And I wanted to know, how does this happen? Why does it happen? How can we make it not happen? Within that research, I was introduced to the work of historian Richard Slotkin, who wrote a trilogy of books that looks at the development of the American myth. And so I brought those here tonight. They're Regeneration Through Violence, The Fatal Environment, and Gunfighter Nation. And in his work, I was introduced to Joseph Campbell. And I immediately saw this connection between what Campbell was saying and Jung's ideas. I was like, well, it is on an individual level, here it is on a cultural level. So by the end of my undergraduate work, I figured out, as many of you might and many of you have, that there was a lot more that I needed to know. And but I decided, this time I am going to pursue my study of Jung. But I wanted to know it in a broader way. I didn't want to go down the individual analyst route. And so I found this program at Pacifica Graduate Institute that it was in-depth psychology, so Jung, but more broadly other theorists as well, and also had the benefit of having the Joseph Campbell archives there. So I was sold. So during my graduate work, that also coincided with the advent of the Iraq War and the global war on terror in general. And to me, having just looked at this sort of playbook for the Vietnam War, I felt like I was watching a repeat. You know, to me it was so obvious, and I couldn't understand why my family didn't see it was obvious, you know? And it was a really difficult time for me because I in my own mind, from my own opinion and viewpoint, I couldn't reconcile what was happening. It seemed mad to me. And but then following Jung, I realized that, you know, you can't know a thing until you're in some sort of relationship with it. If it's just unconscious to you, if it's completely other, you're just living that through projection and negatively, and you really don't know anything at all about it. And so I decided that, you know, coinciding with the end of my graduate work, that I needed to understand our warrior class. I knew nothing about them. I knew no one in the military. I had no idea what motivated them, what kind of people they were, nothing. So I moved my family to Washington, D.C., and during that time period, volunteered at Walter Reed Army Medical Center for a couple of years, 2006 to 2008, and then ended up working in inpatient psychiatry from 2008 to 2010. And as many of you know, I mean, those were years of a very high, what the military calls op tempo, operational tempo. People were just cycling in and out all the time. And the type of, the role that I was in was as clinical coordinator for the transcranial magnetic stimulation clinic. So the protocol for that therapy, which is a treatment for major depressive disorder, is an hour a day, 5 days a week for 6 weeks. So I really got to deeply know a lot of these people that were coming in, going out, their spouses, over, you know, this really intense time period. There were times when I had 6 patients a day. So it was a deep initiation for me into the motivations and the hopes and the fears and the dreams of these people that I had formerly considered completely other than me. And one interesting and humbling thing that I found was that once I got into working within a military structure, it deeply resonated with me. I really loved this idea of having a mission, of putting my personal interests aside, of being engaged in something that I felt was really helping people. And it was a life and death thing. I mean, people were gravely physically and psychologically wounded. So I found myself very quickly identifying more with my military colleagues than my civilian colleagues. So it was kind of, in a lot of ways, it was a complete reversal of my own character and personality, seeing it from this other thing and really identifying with it. Subsequent to that, I ended up working for a different command in the Army and deployed to Afghanistan with the Human Terrain System as a social scientist. And I was in Spin Boldak and Kandahar province over the months of the winter between 2011 and 2012. And I was very fortunate there because I got to work with an amazing group of people that were very supportive of me, were very creative and intelligent, had been there many times and kind of knew the ropes and knew what was possible and what wasn't, and were appreciative for any cultural knowledge that I could provide that would make it easier on them. So I was in a really fortunate situation. Despite of all the terrible things that happened, I had a good group of people around me that I really cared about and that cared about me. Through a non-combat related injury, I had to leave and had to be medevaced out of theater. And as I was on the plane to Landstuhl to the hospital in Germany, I'm thinking, this is the journey that my patients had to take, you know? Where they're, one day you're valid, you're great, you have all these people who love you, and no matter how horrible things are, you're surrounded, you're held, and then you're just gone, you know? And you're there for a few days, whatever, but then you're home within hours, and you're home to a community that has no frame of reference for what was going on there, doesn't really want to know about it, you know, doesn't really want to hear about it. And so it just, while not a veteran, I've had a few experiences that I think are, you know, adjacent to what they've experienced and made me care very deeply about how we can provide this bridge home and create new meaning that is as important. Because, I mean, I've felt this way, and I've heard this from many veterans, that, you know, nothing ever meant as much. Nothing was ever as important. Nothing was ever as good as that relationship. As bad as it was, nothing, that relationship between their peers and their buddies, nothing has ever been as important as that. So how can we get to that place in the culture where something can be that important? It can be that meaningful. And that's been a really, a burning question for me. I don't have the answers to it, but I have some ideas about it that we'll talk about tonight. One thing that I did really came to me during that time was that, we have this archetype of the warrior, but when I learned about this twin hero myth, and it is in so many cultures all over the world, and we'll touch on that, is that very often the warrior is linked with his twin, who is the healer, who is the shaman, and one does the external fight and one does the internal healing, the internal fight, really. And we don't really have that. We teach people how to fight and kill, but we don't teach them how to live. We don't teach them how to heal. And that's not just for our veterans or our military. I mean, that's kind of culturally, There's not really a bridge between those two things. So that was the subject of my dissertation, warrior shaman, creative praxis for conflict resolution. How do we put these two things together? And again, I don't know for sure, but I have a few ideas. And I really believe that the work of Jung and Campbell can be instrumental in whatever that looks like. And so that's why I chose them to highlight and then put this myth tonight. And then in the remaining two talks, we'll look at Parzival and the Grail Quest. And then the last one, we'll look at hero healers of the ancient world in ancient Greece. But we're going to go over a little bit of Jung and Campbell's backgrounds. And as I was putting this together, I mean, I knew their backgrounds, but as I was kind of writing it all out, I didn't realize it must have existed somewhere back here, but how closely aligned so many of their formative experiences were, and the things that they said that transformed them and made them who they were and made their work what it was. And I was just like, 1, 2, 3. So I'm going to share some of those with you, which I think are really amazing. So while Jung saw the dream as our connection with the unseen, with our unconscious, and as a bridge to healing our individual selves, Campbell saw myth as the dream of the culture, performing the same function. So you can really look at these as analogs to one another on an individual and on a cultural level, in my opinion. Both of their work exists primarily outside the academy, but is spread throughout the culture. Even if people don't know them by name, they know some of the words that they came up with and concepts, and they know, some of the films that they influenced. You start naming, you say, oh, I know that. Well, that was Jung, that was Campbell. So whilst not being in the academy, they really are kind of have proliferated throughout the culture. Both met or corresponded with many leading thinkers and artists of their day. Jung corresponded with theologian Victor White and with physicist Wolfgang Pauli. He had a close collaboration with Sigmund Freud for many years. And there were others besides that, but those are some of the major ones that we have records of their correspondence. Campbell was even more so. Campbell was friends with philosopher Jiddu Krishnamurti, Zen Buddhist Daisetsu Suzuki, writers Thomas Mann, John Steinbeck, Heinrich Zimmer, dancer Martha Graham, who his wife was in her company, George Lucas, the list goes on and on. I mean, he really touched a lot of aspects of the culture. They both turned from the hard sciences at one point to something that was more integrated and holistic for them. So Campbell started out in the biological sciences at Dartmouth, and then decided that was not for him, and went into English literature and then medieval literature. Jung originally wanted to look at archaeology, and then decided that's, and even medicine, he was like, he wanted to move beyond that, as we'll get into a little bit of his bio, but as to why. But when he discovered psychiatry, he said, okay, here it is, here's the bridge between, the body and the mind, the body and the soul that I can really hold on to. They were both fluent in several languages. So Jung, Latin, English, German, French, Italian, and Campbell in so many. So Campbell was English, French, German, Old French, Provençal, and Sanskrit. So as any of you all who have studied another language know, it not only expands your vocabulary, but it expands your perspective on your own culture and your own words, your own language. and I can't help but see reflected in their work this really expansive viewpoint from so many different angles and so many different cultures. And I think one of the reasons for that was their study of all these different languages. Something that I haven't heard many people talk about, and there are probably books on it and I just missed it, but I really haven't heard people talk about how deeply their work specifically was influenced by the women in their lives, or by the influence of women. And we'll talk a little bit about more about that within the short bios that I do. But it was profound, and it influenced all of their work. It is throughout their work. And without the influence of these women, we wouldn't have their work. I'll tell you a little bit about that. They both had critical encounters with the warrior archetype, in my view. So Jung was an army doctor during World War I, and he worked with British POWs. And so he, quite specifically, he was in the army during that time period. And I would say that is, his interface with this archetype. And with Campbell, it came through competitive collegiate athletics, which he was, at a very high level in that field. And we'll say a little more about that. For me, also, what deeply connects them in their work is what I call the ethical implications of gnosis. So I think that within both of their work, you will find that they say, when you achieve some level of wisdom, some level of knowing, that isn't just for you to hang on to. It's not just for your own enjoyment and your own betterment. Now you have an obligation to help your community. Now you have this task, this mission to make your family and your community a better place. And I think that is, they're certainly not the only people that have ever said that, but I think that is another thing that really links their work. There's Jung and his study. I like his white socks. I think those are my favorite. So Jung was born in 1875 and died in 1961. He grew up in Basel, Switzerland, attended the University of Basel. His father was a minister in the Swiss Reformed Church. And his mother, here we're going to talk about the influence of women here. His mother was a very eccentric, often depressed woman who spent time in visionary states, talked to spirits. And when Jung was growing up, he was very much in that same pattern. He had really intense dreams, visions, was always creating these really wild things. He would make little mannequins and make up his own secret language. But he had what was difficult for him with his mother's sort of illnesses and her sort of real wild eccentricity, I think was also a part of himself, and that he incorporated. For him, it was not theoretical that there are things that exist outside of the material. He experienced that, and his mother experienced that, and I think that had a really deep impact on his work. After he finished his doctorate, his doctoral dissertation itself was called "On the Psychology and Pathology of So-Called Occult Phenomena," which the subject of this research was his cousin, who was a spiritualist and conducted these seances. And he wanted to look at empirically, phenomenologically, how are people experiencing this? Not is it true or is it not true, but how are people experiencing this and what meaning does it have for them? He collaborated with Sigmund Freud from 1909 to 1912. And what began as a really productive relationship ended pretty badly. And I think amongst many things, it was rooted in Freud's insistence that everything had a material and sexual explanation. That was it. And Jung could never accept that. It wasn't true in his own life. He didn't see it as true in the lives of his patients. And that led to a break. And after that break with Freud, that's when, one thing I forgot to mention, I am going to go back. Both Jung and Campbell spent extended periods in isolation. So Jung for 7 years and Campbell for 5 years, and for different reasons. But they both said that out of those time periods, all of their subsequent work was born. So this is one of Jung's periods of isolation after he broke with Freud. He was on the outs from the psychoanalytic community, from the academic community, professionally. He didn't really have anywhere to go because he knew that whatever they were saying he didn't agree with, but he had not yet articulated his own language and his own theory to explain what he was saying and why. And so for about 7 years, he was continually in these visionary states, having really intense dreams, creating some really beautiful artwork and journals, which were then bound as the Red Book. This is a mandala that he painted from the Red Book. The family kept that until, this wasn't published until 2009, so for almost 40 years after his death, the family kept that. You know, it was almost seen as a source of embarrassment because he was literally, you know, communing with these other energies, and he didn't apologize for it in his work, but he said that, you know, again, out of this time period, all of his subsequent work was born. So, and during that time period as well, there were intermittent periods of Army service, so these were coincided with the war years. So I think 3 or 4 times he would have to go and do his service as an Army doctor with British prisoners of war. Switzerland was neutral, but they were bound to intern soldiers from both sides that had strayed into their territory, so they weren't using it as a strategic through line for either side. When he was doing that, it was during that time that he came up both with this concept of the mandala, which he said is a symbol of the entire self with a capital S, and also this idea of the transcendent function, which we'll talk about here in a second. So his psychology, briefly, is really rooted in this dynamic relationship between the conscious and the unconscious parts of ourselves. Not how to get rid of either one of those things, but how to put them in a working relationship. And one of the ways that you do that is through your dreams, through your creative productions, through the synchronicities that you experience in the world, which are, you know, something that's deeply meaningful to you. You see reflected out here, and there's no way to causally connect them. So all of these things, you know, your reveries, you can utilize those to see what your unconscious is trying to tell you, and how to integrate that into your conscious life. Out of the unconscious comes what he called the archetypes, which are very akin to Plato's forms. You know, these pre-existing structures that then manifest in our world in all of the things that we know. And what is unique about archetypes is that you don't need to explain them to anybody. They instantiate into our world in the form of symbols and stories, and that are immediately recognizable to everybody. You don't have to tell anyone what a father is, a mother is, a wise old man, a wise old woman, a child, a warrior, a healer. It's manifestly evident because they're already inside of ourselves. It was his contention. So they manifest through these symbols, but then in our lives, depending on how balanced or conscious or unconscious we are of them, we live them out through our complexes. So these are attitudes of behavior influenced by the archetypes that, to the extent that they're unconscious, they're going to be destructive, and to the extent that they're conscious, they're going to be creative. So the goal of the entire therapy is what he called individuation, or the development of the self with a capital S. Individuation is bringing all of these disparate parts of ourselves together into a working relationship. Again, not trying to squelch any one voice, but putting them into something that is harmonious, and he called that the self with a capital S. He believed that it was so important that people did this work, that he so radically believed in the individual and the power of them doing their inner work to affect the wider culture. He said this when asked, are we going to destroy ourselves in an atomic war? He said, I think it depends on how many people can stand the tension of the opposites in themselves. If enough can do so, I think the situation will just hold, and we shall be able to creep around innumerable threats and thus avoid the worst catastrophe of all, the final clash of opposites in an atomic war. So, I mean, he literally believed, you know, you doing your work could save the world. And in fact, it was the only thing that would, that there was no policy fix, there was no government fix. And for somebody who had lived through 2 world wars, you know, seeing the power of the mob and the power of the state, he was really deathly afraid of that. He thought people need to do the exact opposite. They need to get inside themselves and do their own work, and everything else will manifest out of that. So turning to Campbell, Campbell was born in 1904 and lived till 1987. He was born in White Plains, New York, to second-generation Irish immigrant parents. He had a very comfortable upbringing and attended first a Dartmouth University and then switched to Columbia. where he was performed in collegiate athletics at a very high level. For a time, he was one of the fastest half-mile runners in the world. He missed the Olympic trials by seconds, which remained a sort of disappointment for him. But again, I think that really is exemplary of his encounter with the warrior archetype. He said that he learned more about living during that time as an athlete than any other time in his life, what it takes to win, what it takes to lose, all of that, pushing yourself beyond what you think you're capable of. So I really believe that, as I said, that was his encounter with the warrior. The end of his graduate work, so he received a fellowship from Columbia to study in Europe, and he studied at the universities of Paris and Munich. And there he learned German, Old French, Provençal, studied medieval literature. And when he came back to Columbia, he said, okay, I want to write a dissertation that's going to combine, my interest in medieval literature and modern art and Sanskrit. And they politely said no. And he probably just as politely said, well, I don't want your doctorate anyway. So that coincided with the Great Depression, with the years of the Great Depression. And he moved to some cabins up in Woodstock, New York. And there were several people living there, and he said nobody worked because there wasn't any work. So he figured out a way to send off for books from publishers. He would send them $1 or something, and they'd send him books to review. And then he'd read them and send them back and get the next batch. And he said he spent those 5 years, he read for 9 hours a day, every day for 5 years. And out of that huge, intense period of study and isolation, that's where the monomyth was born. That's where this hero journey that we're going to talk about came out of, because he was able to look at all of these different stories in relationship and see the connections between them. And so that's in that handout too, this arc of the story that we're going to go through and where the two came from their father. Regarding women, so his wife was as I said, a dancer in Martha Graham's company, then ended up starting her own company called Theater of the Open Eye. They collaborated on several productions together that would combine storytelling and myth with interpretations of modern dance. So her influence on him was really deep, and for him one of the things that made that connection. He was always an appreciator and a lover of art, but helped him make that connection between the storytelling and the expression and art. Also, after his period up in Woodstock, he began teaching. He taught at Sarah Lawrence College for 35 years, which is an all-women's college. And he said that the influence of his students is what gave him his myth. He's quoted, he says, Euripides said, the myth is not my own, I have it from my mother. And he said, well, I got my myth from my students. And he said that because he's like, to these women, they didn't care about the date. They didn't care about the names of the characters, exactly who wrote it. They wanted to know what these myths meant in their own lives. And it forced him to develop that, to articulate this, saying, well, okay, well, that's an old story, great. What does it mean for me right now? And so I think we can thank those women for pushing him to do that, and that a lot of that work came out of. He says that there are 4 functions of myth. There's pedagogical, sociological, cosmological, and metaphysical. So the pedagogical is the simple, straightforward teaching. Don't do this, don't go there, simple morality, what to do and what not to do, basic learning, as you're coming up in a society. The sociological is going to teach you how you need to be in that society as an adult, as a child too, but mostly as an adult, and that's going to be very particular to that culture. The cosmological is, where's our place in the universe? Who created us? How did we get here, and where are we going? And the metaphysical is the idea of, how do we touch the thing that we cannot see? How do we touch the thing that we cannot name? How do we experience that which is completely beyond our known experience here? The hero journey, as developed by him, is the most salient to what we're going to talk about here. And this was taken from his first solo book, published in 1948, The Hero with 1,000 Faces. We're going to see this outlined throughout our entire, throughout the Navajo story we'll tell. I'll let him tell this in his own words. The mythological hero, setting forth from his common day hut or castle, is lured, carried away, or else voluntarily pursued to the threshold of adventure. There he encounters a shadow presence that guards the passage. The hero may defeat or conciliate this power and go alive into the kingdom of the dark, brother battle, dragon battle, offering, charm, or be slain by the opponent and descend in death. So this journey of descent and trial and return was described by anthropologist Victor Turner in Dembu culture in Africa, and then he made many studies of it all over the world, following the earlier ethnologist Arnold von Gennep, and those stages being separation, liminality, and return. And we're going to see all of that here in this story as well. So it wasn't just a theory that Campbell read in a book. This was something that was being experienced and recorded by anthropologists as indigenous cultures. So the story we're going to go over tonight, Where the Two Came from Their Father, was given to Campbell by Navajo singer, in their own language, hataalii, Jeff King. Jeff King was one of the most respected Navajo singers of the early 20th century. He was about 70 years old when he gave this to Maud Oakes. He was born in about 1865 and lived till 1964. He lived to be almost 100 years old. And I would like to say that, we just went over the biographies of these two men, Jung and Campbell, who have many books and whole courses of study devoted to them, but I would also like to honor that, Jeff King's research and study and practice of his field also took a lifetime and represents, if they were all in books, there would be many, many volumes. So he began his training as a singer when he was 10 years old, and that lasted 4 years. And at the time he gave this to Oakes, he said, "I'm still learning." It cost him a relative fortune in his own time. And at this time, he was giving this to, this is ethnologist Maud Oakes. She was an ethnologist and an artist, and she had lived on the Navajo reservation for 3 years. She was deeply interested in their culture and their art, and she could see what was happening as well, that these rituals were dying out. At the time, Jeff King was giving this ritual to Navajo recruits that were going into World War II. It was the same ritual that they would give warriors before they went into battle from time immemorial in their group, in their nation and tribe. And it was designed to convert the civilian or secular consciousness into a military consciousness. You're going to go somewhere and it's going to be different, so you need a new set of stories. As I said, it's distinct from the Navajo blessing way and the enemy way. The enemy way was the ceremonial they would use to bring the warriors back home. But he insisted that it existed outside of those two ceremonies. And he acknowledged that it was in danger of going away. And he knew that he believed that he could trust Maud Oakes. She had been a friend. She had lived amongst them. And he said to her, "It is good, I will give. You have been kind to my friends. None of the young men want to learn this ceremony. They feel if they know one song, they know all. My heart is sad, for when I die, this goes with me. You have had a blessing ceremony performed over you, so I will give." So I'm deeply grateful that he made that decision, and we can share this now and be blessed by it ourselves. The ceremony lasted either 2 nights and 1 day or 5 nights and 4 days. And it went along with a series of paintings that were on buckskin and then done in pollen and sand and flower petals. And upon these paintings, the young men would either sit or stand. So they had physical contact with these images. And they were intimately part of the story. The art and the story and the ritual were one. He gave these to Maud Oakes. He just drew them out on sort of brown paper with a crayon, and she recreated them with the paint wash on buckskin. And I'm really grateful to Ursinus College in Pennsylvania that actually exhibited these paintings in 2023, so we had really easily accessible digital images to find of them. They're also in that book, in this book. Well, they're actually not. So this book, this is Where the Two Came to Their Father. So the story we're about to go over is book length. We're going to condense it. And this was actually the first book that Joseph Campbell ever had his name on. So co-authored with Jeff King and Maud Oakes. So that's kind of a synchronicity too. The book's kind of expensive, and the one they have in the library does not have the portfolio with the paintings, but I have it here if you're interested, and all of those images are on the handouts as well. So this story as I said, is about the twin heroes, Nainasgani and Tobajishchini, killer of enemies and born of water. And I chose this story to begin the series because, as I said, for me, this archetype of the twin heroes has always deeply resonated. How do we do the external thing, and then how do we also do the internal thing? That these are really two halves of a whole. And the twin heroes are really ubiquitous within Native American culture, both North and South America. I mean, quick internet search will bring up a dozen images for you. So we're going to explore this Navajo expression of that, but I want to quickly go through some European examples to show that it's definitely, we're not going to do Asian examples, but there are many examples in European culture, and some of them we're going to encounter in the next two talks. So I just wanted to quickly go through that. So this is Nainasgani on the right, and Tobajishchini on the left, and Tobajishchini on the right. These were as photographed by Edward Curtis. These really gorgeous images. And for the European examples, we have the Dioscoroi in Greece. We have Polydeuces and Castor, who became later the Castor and Pollux of the Romans. So some of the attributes that we find in twin heroes all over the world is there's usually some sort of divine parentage. They usually are seen as kind of two aspects of one being. One is more outward directed and one is more inward directed. So those are the general outlines of what we see with the twin heroes across cultures. So this is Machaon and Podalirius, and while they were not stated as explicitly immortal, their father's, Asclepius, his father was Apollo. So they did have some divine parentage there. And then later on, as myths tend to change and shift, Aeolus Aristides described them as the Dioscoroi. A Greek orator described them that they were the Dioscoroi. So somehow over time, they shifted into this role, at least for some people, into that. They were both known as warriors and gifted healers. And that was in ancient Greece. Here's on Sicily, this is the Palikoi, and again, divine parentage. Not much is known about their rites or worship. They were seen as guarding springs and geysers, and people would have to go swear oaths at their shrines. These are the twin heroes broadly in Indo-European culture. This image is from a helmet that was uncovered in the Sutton Hoo burial in England in the 30s. And so this is an example from Anglo-Saxon culture. And then Hengist and Horsa, the legendary brothers who supposedly led the invasion of England by the Angles and Danes and Jutes. Again, we're just seeing this duplication of these two brothers that tend to have, like, as I said, slightly different attributes, but almost seen as, one and the same in some degree. And then Parzival and Ferifiz. So we're going to explore Parzival in the next talk. And Ferifiz was his half-brother, the same father. His mother was a Moorish queen, so Ferifiz is Muslim. He's described as black and white, piebald. And, while they're not explicitly twins and not having, well, they both do, we'll have to get into it in Parzival, but there is this essence of them being divine and on some level being an expression of the same energy in two different people. So here's the story where the two came to their father. And as I said, each of these paintings was part of this ritual that these warriors would either stand upon or sit upon. And I'll also say that we're going to see this mandala and the quaternity. I don't think I mentioned that actually with Jung, that he said one expression of the self was the quaternity, so the four parts that make up the whole. And that's why you'll see this number 4 in so many myths and legends and artwork, is because it is a representative of the whole, and we're going to see that many times in this myth. Also, every color has a meaning in these paintings, but there are 3 different systems for the colors, so it would take a really long time to explain them all for each painting, and we're not going to do that, but I encourage everybody to, read this book and look into it more deeply if that's of interest to you. So after the Navajo people had emerged from the underworld, they were filled with the seeds of all things. And in the middle is the house of changing woman. She was born miraculously of a cloud, this white cross in the middle is her home. And one day she went down to the spring to bathe, and the sun shone upon her, and she conceived miraculously. She was born miraculously. She conceives miraculously. She gives birth to a son. Now at this time, the whole neighborhood, the whole community was being troubled by these giant monsters, and everybody was in grave danger. So when she had to go down to the spring again, she put the baby in a little type of hole in the ground cradle and went back. And this time, the moon shone upon her, and she conceived again. So now she has 2 boys. Throughout this story, much later, until the nadir of their journey, they don't know their names. We're going to use their names, but keep in mind that they don't know their names yet. So the child of the sun is killer of enemies, and the child of the moon is born for water, or child of the water. They use the terms interchangeably. When they reach about 12 years old, they decide that they've got to do something. They've got to save their mother and the community from the monsters. They need to go to their father, the sun, to get the weapons that are powerful enough to do that. And their mothers warn them continually, don't stray, don't go anywhere, don't get into any trouble, you know, I mean, you're gonna get eaten, you're gonna get killed. But they decide that this is what they have to do. So one day she comes out and they're gone, and she throws her moccasins up to figure out which way. She throws them, you know, to the east, the south, the north. They all come back to her, but when she throws it straight up, it gets carried right up into the sky, and she knows that they've gone to their father, the sun. So standing here facing east, they're caught up by Rainbow Man. He takes them around this mountain 4 times and to the end of the known world, to the white sands. And this is Sand Dune Boy. These are the brothers here represented by these 2 crosses and the Rainbow Man who brought them there. So Sand Dune Boy's job is he has really long arms, and he grabs people's heads and smothers them in the sand and kills them so they never get past the threshold. And Campbell says, you know, you have to go past the threshold. You have to get past these guardians because the community are the ones who are stuck or in trouble. So it's of a necessity that you get past these thresholds. So heaping praise upon him, you know, oh, beautiful Sand Dune Boy, you're the most wonderful thing we've ever seen. He'd never received such praise, and he said, okay, well, I'll let you pass this time. They have to perform this same ritual at the next of these 3 mountains. So again, we're seeing this number 4, this quaternity. And with that complete, they've left the known world. Along their way, they're now in sort of a featureless landscape, this desolate wasteland that's totally unfamiliar to them. And they come across, the first figure they come across is a crone, and she's Old Age. Her name is Old Age. And you're going to hear this repeated throughout the story. She says, what are you earth people doing here? Like, this is no place for an earth person to venture. They say, we're going to our father, the sun, for weapons to kill the monsters. And she says, well, you know, it's a really long way. You're going to get old by the time you get there. So here's what you do. Don't walk on my path. Walk to the left of it. Okay, thank you. They immediately walk on her path. They immediately forget. And Campbell notes this as so many heroes do. They forget, they make stupid mistakes. We'll see this a lot in Parzival. So they immediately start becoming old. And she comes back to them and says, what have you done? I told you what not to do. And they said, well, can you help us? Can you make us young again? So she gathers the moisture up off of all of her body and rubs it on them, and they become young again. And she reminds them, now do what I said. Stay to the left of my path. And they go on. The next figure they encounter is another crone, Spider Woman. And so these are the helpers in that mythological round that you have the printout of, and we'll see again in a moment. These are the figures that come to the aid of the heroes. And Campbell likens them to fairy godmothers in our fairy tales. But Spider Woman asks them the same question. What are you earth people doing here? They tell her, to weapons, you know, to help our people from our father. And she says, well, why don't you stay with me? I can help you. I can give you some things that will protect you on your way. Stay the night with me. Don't worry, I can slow the sun down. She casts a web over the sky and slows the sun down. So we have this ambiguity. Well, who's more powerful? She can slow the sun down? You know, it's this really interesting sort of balance. Her kindness to them was said to be the beginning of kindness in the world. So she gives them different talismans. She gives them turquoise and white shell to swallow. She gives them each a white feather to hold on to. She says, if you hold on to this feather, then you'll be okay. You'll be okay for your next test, but don't tell your father, the sun, because I stole it from him. So And then that was considered, her asking them to deceive him was considered the origin of lies in the world. So she's considered both the origin of kindness and of lies. So there's that ambivalence that we have in myths around pairs of opposites and right and wrong, etc. So they go on their way, and there's the white feather. It's kind of hard to see on here. But they face these obstacles, the cattail people who stab, the rocks that clap together, the reeds that cut. But holding on to this magical feather, they survive. And Rainbow Man is helping them as well. Having passed these tests, so here we've gone, they've been called, they've received this help, they've performed, well in these tests, they've received second sets of help, and they now cross the cosmic ocean. So we know it's the cosmic ocean because what they've done is they've rendered the 3D onto a flat plane here. Here are the 4 mountains of the world, and the ocean is surrounding all. And the feathers there in between them is kind of hard to see. But they cross the cosmic ocean on the way to their father's house. And Campbell notes that this is a standard motif in myths, the Okeanos of the Greeks and many other cultures. But they finally come to the guardians of their father's house. And Campbell also notes here that these animals are not rendered naturalistically. They're rendered in the form of their spiritual reference. The Navajo knew what animals looked like. They chose to represent them in this way, to show their power in this setting, in this situation. So they pass big snake, big bear, big thunder, and big wind. So again, we have the 4. The number is just repeated over and over again. And in this ritual, the initiate would walk along this line and then turn, and then ritually he would wash his hair in yucca suds to be purified. And as Campbell notes, you have to have the purification before you have the revelation. So having passed these guardians, they come to the house of the sun. This is a depiction of the macrocosm within the microcosm. You've got microcosm within the macrocosm. You've got the 4 directions. You've got the ocean of the world. Here are all the trials the brothers have been through. This is the horse that the sun rides on, and this is his daughter. So his daughter asks them what question? What are you earth people doing here? And they say, well, we're here to get weapons from our father. She says, well, he's going to make it really hard on you. So here's what I'll do. I'm going to wrap you up in clouds, and I'm going to stuff you away behind these doors so that he doesn't kill you as soon as he sees you. So she puts them behind the doors of their colors, killer of enemies in black and child of the water under the green. So the son comes home, hangs his shield rattling on the wall, and asks his wife, so who are those 2 boys I saw coming in here? So the camouflage apparently didn't work very well. And she says, well, they say they're your sons, and doesn't waste the opportunity to scold him on his loose behavior while he's away from home, because there's 2 sons she didn't know about. So he says, well, they do they? Well, we'll see about that. And he submits them to a series of tests. Or he just outright tries to kill them. He feeds them poison cornmeal. They hold on to the feather and survive. He tries to sweat them to death. They hold on to the feather. He throws them against the spikes of the 4 or tries to throw them on the spikes of the 4 directions. They hold on to the feather and they survive, whereupon he admits that they must be his sons. So having achieved that, he stands them upon buffalo skins of their own color. And you may not have noticed, but in the past slides, these 2 figures were represented by 2 different colors, or excuse me, by the same color. And here they each have their own color. So he stands them upon these buffalo skins, and the thunder crashes and the lightning flashes, and he finally reveals to them their true names. They up until this point, they have had no names. So in their second birth through the father, through attaining this new agency through their adventure, they receive their names. And then they become so powerful, they become 4 beings. So again, the quaternity representing the whole. And these other 2 figures are described as reared underground and changing grandchild. But Jeff King says there were 2 and then there were 4. So he doesn't really distinguish that these are separate from the twins, but rather, aspects of them. So having received their names and, receiving their parentage from their father, or their paternity being recognized, they're ready to go home.
So he gives them a final test. You know, what are your names? What is the name? Where's the hole in the sky? What is the name of the holy mountain? And for the answers, they get some help. They have Big Fly and Little Wind that whisper the answers into their ears. And Campbell humorously notes, you know, you might say this is cheating, but it's not cheating, because if you wouldn't have been worthy, you wouldn't have received the inspiration. So if you're supposed to pass the exam, you'll pass. So they descend through this hole in the sky down to Mount Taylor. These are meant to be their footprints. Before they can go home, though, they have to battle the archetypal monster, whose name is Big Giant. Now, this Big Giant is also a son of the sun, but the sun does intervene to help them to defeat him. It's noted that one characteristic of monsters is they mistake shadow for substance. So the monster, the Big Giant, seeing their reflection upon the water, thinks it's actually them and swallows them up and tries to digest them, and does this 4 times. And he's unable to kill them, and as I said, the sun intervenes and helps them, and they're able to kill this archetypal monster. So now, after they've done that, they are ready to go home. Walking around the foot of Mount Taylor, though, they trip and they drop their father weapons. Luckily for them, upon their return, they meet Talking God. Talking God is the male ancestor of the female line of gods. So he is already combined in his substance. He's dual in his nature. And he gives them the weapons that they need to defeat the earthly monsters, which are dual weapons. They're male and female weapons. So now they have what they need. They've defeated the archetypal monster. Now they can defeat the earthly monster. But after they do this, they are very nearly wiped out. They've lost their arms and legs. Child of the Water is in danger of becoming a mere shadow of killer of enemies. And they continue to sicken and lose weight. They're not getting any better. So the gods, called the holy people, come to them and decide that they're going to enact a ceremony to restore and to heal them. And the ceremony is the telling of where the two came to their father. It's telling them their own story. They enact this ritual 4 times. That is what heals them. Their own story is what heals them. And after being healed, they again come into full power on this plane and become 4 beings. The wholeness, the quaternity, that symbol of the self. So Joseph Campbell describes this story as the typical mythological adventure, leaving the bounded world in which you have been brought up, going beyond all of what anyone knows into domains of transcendence, acquiring what is missing, and coming back with the boon, a perfectly beautiful example of the hero journey. Within a Jungian framework, we could describe the story itself as examples of that transcendent function. Stories and symbols, artwork, that are that bridge between what you know and you do not know about yourself, what you're able to see in another story, in another piece of art that allows you to comprehend something new about yourself. Once you're done, you can do what these twin heroes have done. You know, they've claimed their own self-agency. They've gained new names. They have a new mission for themselves and their community. And I really believe that the experiences of our warriors and veterans could be analogous to this type of initiation if we can see their journeys and their traumas as a type of initiation. But that's predicated on the ability to define the return, to come up with a new set of, new naming and new stories that can articulate what that's going to mean for them at home. So I'm going to look at how some complementary practices and ideas with some modern thinkers who I think approximate in some ways these ideas of Jung and of Campbell, and also folks that are continuing this ritual of storytelling through the media of theater and the performing arts. So we just talked about the arc there. So on the left is Jonathan Shay, the psychiatrist and writer Jonathan Shay, and his books Achilles in Vietnam and Odysseus in America both really focus on his work with veterans He's been working with veterans from the Vietnam War on, and he began seeing these distinct correlations between their experience and what he knew of, both in the Iliad and in the Odyssey. And he was seeing something that was more than physical trauma and PTSD, these normal reactions to abnormal situations. That there was something that was causing this trauma to metastasize in people that went beyond these physical manifestations. And over time, he developed this idea of moral injury, which includes, he says it includes 3 distinct characteristics: having experienced a betrayal of what's right by those in leadership in a high-stakes situation. That there's something that happens when those things combine that causes your soul to be wounded. And it takes a lot more than traditional therapy or medication to move beyond those experiences. He prescribes policy fixes for the military, cohesion, leadership, and training. So keeping units together throughout their deployments, through formation and deployment and return, being able to process their experiences together, leadership, giving really intense ethical leadership to officers, so that this betrayal of what's right doesn't happen in the first place. And then also the training part of it being preparing service members for the realities of what they will actually experience in a combat situation, rather than platitudes about bravery and patriotism and heroism. Like these are the realities of war. So those are the policy fixes. But for me, the heart of his work is this idea of the communalization of trauma, which is telling stories, like peers of veterans being together and telling their own stories within a community of care. And it's his contention, and I think this really does correspond to Jung, that the mental health professional is a stagehand in this process. They are not the ones on center stage. You can make the room look nice, you can invite the folks, you can set up the projector, but you are not the one that's telling the story, and you are not the one that is going to fix it. This is something that at the end of the day must be done by the veteran themselves, and ideally with the support of peers. He said, peers are the key to recovery. So I really see that as very much analogous to Jung's work. In the work of writer and war correspondent Sebastian Junger, who's written many books, including The Perfect Storm, War, and Tribe, which I brought with me here, and also is the director of the films Restrepo and Korengal. He, through his long-term observation of our most recent conflicts, his observation was that it's this lack of sense of purpose and meaning and community when people come home. It's a lack of a cohesive story about what they've been through and a community that's willing to accept it that causes this long-term damage. In the book Tribe, he focuses on how different Native American cultures handled that for themselves at different time periods, and notes that even after the Vietnam War, tribes in Oklahoma were holding intertribal powwows that were open to all races, performing those same rituals with which they had welcomed back their own warriors, and highlighting the unique attributes of warriors, which are, courage, self-discipline, leadership, the willingness to protect others. That you're home and you're still a warrior, and here's your job. You've got to maintain this protection of your own community, and that it's the lack of that in his view is one of the major causes of pathology, not only individually, but I correlate him more to Campbell because he's zoomed out and looking at it more on a sociological level. And one thing he says in Tribe is, the beauty and tragedy of the modern world is that it eliminates many situations that require people to demonstrate a commitment to the collective good. And one of the things he advocates for is this idea of the Vets Town Hall. So on Veterans Day, but any time really, but especially on Veterans Day, that cities should open up their town halls for them to come and tell their stories, and that people should be compelled to come and listen. If we're going to send these people to do these things, we should at least listen to what they experienced when they were there. He thinks that's one of the keys to healing this sort of divide between the civilian and military communities, along with finding some way for our veterans to have meaning when they come home within the community, whether it's jobs or just the role itself of a continuing duty to protect and serve and provide leadership. So while both of them were talking about how we're going to do this in groups, it's contingent upon peers. People have to support each other and they have to tell their stories. This is nothing new. And this has been going on a long time. So on the left we have Aeschylus, and on the right we have Sophocles. And as Shay noted, these were veterans that were writing plays for veterans, about veterans, to be performed to veterans. And in Greece, theater was acting as a ritual, and story, and as public catharsis. And it was ongoing. There really wasn't a separation between the story itself and what was happening in their contemporary world. These things were simultaneous in a lot of ways. So this use of theater and storytelling and ritual to heal not only the individual, but the community has been going on for a very long time. And it's continued today within theater. So on the left is Brian Dories, who founded the Theater of War Productions. And they do dramatic readings of different classical works, different tragedies, to audiences, many times in military installments. Or I actually got to see it the year they were formed at Walter Reed, and it was really powerful. So they would do a dramatic reading, then have a discussion, a panel discussion, have an audience discussion, and it was uniquely transformative in its experience of this dialogical interaction between the audience and the performers. On the right is Ed Tick. He's a therapist that has been leading pilgrimages both to Vietnam, so he'd take Vietnam veterans, healing journeys back to Vietnam, and then for the past 20 years, taking veterans, not only veterans, but that's his focus, to different sites in ancient Greece, to temples, battlefield sites, healing centers, and using myth and literature, poetry and tragedy for the veterans to evoke their own stories and tell them in that place, and again, to find a new meaning for themselves of how they can place their trauma it's not about eliminating the trauma, it's about placing it in a wide enough field so that it can be contained and not overwhelm the individual. Continuing this tradition, this is Augusto Boal on the left. So he was a playwright and director. He's Brazilian, and during the 60s and the 80s, during the Dirty Wars in Brazil, he came up with this idea and method that he called the theater of the oppressed. So being a creative theater person, he's like, how do I solve this problem in my community? I know what my tools are. They're telling stories. They're telling stories with your body. And so the method is, the main points of it is that the community, the group of people in the community itself would get together, decide what story they wanted to tell, to raise awareness or to change a situation. They're not professional actors, but then they themselves would act the story out, and then they would get feedback from the audience. And they found it to be hugely transformational in these communities. These communities actually figured out, here's what we're going to do to fight back against, this horrible oppression. I mean, people were, again, just like in Chile, being disappeared and murdered and tortured and imprisoned. He himself was tortured and imprisoned and eventually exiled. And he came to Europe and wanted to do this same method, but figured out that European folks had a different set of problems. They weren't under direct physical threat, but they still had their own traumas. So he came up with another method that he called Rainbow of Desire. I have books back there by him that are really interesting. I took some classes in this in my graduate work and some training afterwards, and I can attest to the fact that it is a powerfully transformational method, to tell your story and then have other people act it out for you, and to be able to see yourself not as a victim anymore, to be empowered to see yourself as a part of that story but not stuck in it. So on the right is Dr. Merv Westwood. He's doing a very similar method in Canada. His organization is called the Veterans Transition Network, and he calls it therapeutic enactment. So there is somebody who is actively doing this specific type of therapeutic theater and ritual storytelling with veterans. Lastly, this is Roman Baca, and he was a classically trained ballet dancer. And in 2001, when the various wars came along, he decided that, being a warrior was something that was deeply part of himself. He wanted to help. He wanted, in his own heart, he wanted to help and protect and defend, people who couldn't defend themselves. So he joined the Marine Corps. He ended up being a machine gunner and fire team leader in the Fallujah campaign. That's him in Fallujah. When he came back, again, he said, what are my gifts? I'm a dancer. This is what I can do. This is how I can tell stories. So he founded Exit 12 Dance Company, and they're now based in the UK. But they use choreography to tell these military stories and to help people understand what the experience of being in that role and then coming home and being in the role of a veteran at home, what that actually feels like. So another creative way, using the performing arts to tell these stories, and really it is a type of public ritual that is healing both for the individual and the community. So we looked at some ideas for Jung and Campbell and how they correlate to this natural story where the children to their father. Within that story, as Campbell said, we see the whole arc of the hero journey, the monomyth in itself, how we leave what is known, we go into the danger, we overcome these trials and tests, and we come back as different people. We bring forth what he called the boon, and that's the gift. But if we don't get back, if we stay stuck in this liminality, then that's a very damaging place because there's no real identity there. It's as all of these figures said to them, what are you Earth people doing here? It's not a place to live in. It's a place to traverse. And I feel like what we're seeing with a lot of our veteran population is because we don't have defined roles for our warriors within community, that when they come home, there's not a place for them. And they're drifting in that liminal state where and many of them make that journey, make that transition. And what my contention is that we could do it on a much deeper level by saying, it's not just about and you're happy and you have a good job, but what is your continuing mission? That's deeply important, to our communities right now. So I hope that I have given you a little bit of food for thought and maybe some energy for action to continue or begin doing this work. It tends to be a lot more difficult than the inner journey, but I feel like that, once you start engaging this material, it kind of takes on a life of its own. And Campbell had this term that he's called follow your bliss, which people have misconstrued as do whatever you want. And that's not what he meant at all. What he meant by your bliss is that gift that you can bring forth that, out of your own suffering, out of your own challenges, that enables you and will hold your deep attention both in your suffering and in your joy. It's strong enough to hold both of those opposites. So in Jungian terms, it performs that transcendent function. It bridges that gap. So we'll take some questions now. Thank you all so much.